Hi everyone, today I am starting a brand new series on my YouTube channel, 100 Modern Masterpieces Guaranteed to Improve Your Chess. I have been noodling on this series all year, thinking about games I want to cover, topics I want to cover, how I want to organize all of it, and ultimately, I am just very excited to begin. 2025 marks the quarter turn of the century, and to me, it seems a perfect time to dive into modern masterpieces. In many cases, I think that games from 100 years ago are actually better known than modern gems. The advent and ubiquity of the engine drives many to take a surface look at these recent games. They only see which moves are right or wrong according to the engine. The idea behind both players' moves can easily be overlooked. Accuracy can be celebrated over genius and creativity and instructivity. This also means that only the games of the very top players are celebrated. Gorgeous games by the many active masters in the world can easily be missed. While I wanted to look at modern masterpieces, I didn't want to just look at pretty games. I wanted to create something whole and lasting, something of which I can be proud. Ultimately, I've settled on a course I'm calling 100 Modern Masterpieces Guaranteed to Improve Your Chess. I'm covering everything you need to know, from the opening to the endgame, with each game illustrating a particular theme. For new players, you'll be exposed to hundreds of powerful ideas that you can immediately put to use in your games. For advanced players, you will find all kinds of gorgeous games that you have almost certainly missed. I'll start by quoting two Julie Andrews songs. First, let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. And second, well begun is half done. The opening is where the scene is set for all battles in chess, and the center is typically the key point in those battles. Today's game is a beautiful illustration of the principle, control the center. The center is the high ground in chess, the four squares in the middle of the board, e4, d4, e5, and d5. Pieces can use the center to easily move to any part of the board. Pieces in the center also typically have more mobility, controlling more squares. It's important to note that pieces that are in the center don't control the center because pieces don't control the squares on which they stand. Be wary of occupying the center too quickly with your pieces or pawns. In most cases, you want to establish control of the center with pawns at the very beginning of the game. The ideal pawn center is pawns on both e4 and d4 for white, or e5 and d5 for black. In some cases, players may not occupy the center with pawns right away. Instead, they may opt for rapid development of pieces that target the center, and later, these pieces may support pawn advances to attack the center. In either case, though, both players in a strong chess game will be focused on a compelling central strategy. In today's game, we see what happens when Grandmaster Gadir Guseinov abandons the center, hoping that Grandmaster Zoltan Almasi will overextend when he takes it. Instead, Guseinov is blown out of the water thanks to determined and vigorous sacrificial play by Almasi. Almasi begins the game here with pawn to e4, of course, the most natural move claiming the center, and Guseinov responds with pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense. Now, for newer players, the Sicilian defense may seem very unintuitive. After all, most like to begin the game with pawn to e5, which immediately stakes an equal claim in the center. But the Sicilian defense has a central strategy. It's just a little more complicated. The idea is that if white wants to progress in the center, white will need to play pawn d4 at some point, allowing black to exchange. Then black will have two central pawns to white's one central pawn. That gives black good long-term chances at better central control and a strong endgame in many cases. However, as part of that strategy, white will retain the only advanced central pawn in most lines of the Sicilian defense. That gives white an early central advantage and chances to blow black off the board, which is something we will see in this game. So after e4, c5, we see knight f3 and pawn to g6. This is the hyper-accelerated dragon. The actual dragon goes pawn to d6 first, restraining this pawn's advance. Then we get d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6. This attacks this pawn. Now, in the game, we are going to see white get an extra pawn in the center of the board, and white cannot do that easily in this version of the game because knight c3 is now needed to provide the most effective defense of this pawn, and that knight is now blocking this pawn's advance. The hyper-accelerated dragon gives white an additional option to put that c-pawn up in the middle of the board. But on the other hand, black gets a little faster development as a result. So after pawn g6, we get d4, cd4, knight d4, knight c6, and pawn to c4. These are the two central pawns that I was talking about. Now, this actually has a name. This is called the Moroxi bind. White gets a big space advantage and a nice central control. White's goal is to kind of wrap the white position around the black position like an anaconda, absolutely strangling black. However, if black breaks free, which black manages to do in a number of cases, then white can end up really overextended. An anaconda is not very effective if at any point it loses control of its prey. And that can happen if black ever gets a big central break like d5 or b5 or f5, something like that at some point. But in this game, we see pawn c4, knight to f6, now knight c3, knight takes d4, and queen takes d4. In this position, the most common theoretical move, which is playable for black, is pawn to d6. This move restrains both of white's pawns in the center. Of course, it makes a ton of sense. But Guseinov in this position tries a different theoretical choice, bishop to g7. This fianchettoed bishop has this long diagonal, but of course the question must be asked. What if white advances the pawn in the center of the board, attacking the knight? In fact, this move from Guseinov is really like waving a red flag in front of a bull, and Almasi charges forward right here, pawn to e5. Now, of course, these are two grandmasters playing, so it's not like Guseinov wasn't aware of this possibility. After the pawn advances, Guseinov is hoping that eventually he'll be able to attack the pawn and trade it off. If white or either player overextends with pawns in the center of the board early in the game, but then those pawns just get traded, then white can just lose time by pushing the pawns too far up the board, and the position can collapse. For a really good example of this, see the game between Letellier and Bobby Fischer. I have a video on my channel. It is a spectacular game, well worth your time. That's not going to happen in this case, though. After pawn to e5, the knight falls back to g8. Now, this is the intention, trying to get this pawn break in, break down the center, and have good play for this strong bishop. Also, black is hoping that white's queen can be overextended in the middle of the board, which is something you have to be careful about. If the queen gets harassed in the middle, she'll have to keep running around. But she's also very strong. And so here we get bishop f4, pawn d6, trying to trade off this e5 pawn that provides so much strong central control. And in this position, Almasi castles queenside. So this provides some safety for the king. It gets the king out of the center of the board, and it also brings the rook right into the middle. Now, in this position, black cannot exchange this pawn on e5, because if, of course, you capture, then queen takes d8, wins the queen, and in fact is just checkmate in one move. Here's where Guseinov had his intended reply. Bishop to g4. This move attacks the rook and it defends the queen on d8 because now the rook and the queen are connected. So the idea is that you will move the rook and then black will take on e5, and actually black has quite a decent position. This is a great moment to pause your video and try to figure out what you would play as white. What Almasi does is meet black's threat to the rook on d1 with a greater threat. Pawn to c5, a brilliant exchange sacrifice that just blows apart the position. Now, after pawn c5, of course, The central pressure on d6 is massive, but additionally, the bishop is no longer blocked by the c-pawn, so the bishop is ready to come in with a powerful, powerful check. At this point, black really doesn't have a good alternative to taking the material. Bishop takes d1. If you don't do this, then you're just getting pushed off of the board. You've got to take material and hope that you can survive. Guseinov does make a good effort. So after bishop takes d1, we get bishop b5 check. The king slides over to f8. Of course, this is undesirable because the king has lost the right to castle. Not only can the king be unsafe in some lines, a bigger problem is that because black can't castle, this rook is now really hard to develop as well. I'm looking at this game through the lens of central control and this early central tension, but there is also an important story here about development. After rook takes d1, this is a great moment to freeze frame for a second and assess this position. Now, black is up 2 points, right? Because in this position, black has an extra rook for the bishop on b5. Pawns are equal in this position. But of course, material by itself does not win chess games, and you have to assess the quality of the pieces. In this position, all of black's pieces are either basically without any squares to move to, aka the bishop on g7, or still on their starting squares. They are totally restricted. Meanwhile, all of the pieces that white has are developed, and they're all developed to powerful squares in the center of the board. Additionally, white has these beautiful pawns on e5 and on c5. White totally controls the center and has a lead in development. It's also a problem for black that not only is black underdeveloped in this position and lacking central control, but black doesn't really have good ways to develop. It is very hard to get any of the black pieces to active squares anytime in the near future. So, what is black to do in this position? Well, first off, the most natural move, I would argue, is trying to play knight h6, trying to develop this knight that is stuck on the back rank. Unfortunately, in this position, white has pawn takes d6, and after pawn takes d6, white can just move the queen, and this pawn is falling. White will regain an important pawn, and all of the white pieces are surging through. If black tries to defend with knight f5, white can just push the pawn up to g4, push the knight away, and then win this pawn. And that pawn is really a critical defensive pawn in the black position. So, backing up here, what black tries, I think, is really quite smart. Guseinov tries the move pawn to d5. This move is giving up the pawn, but the idea is that black wants to try to trade queens. If the queens come off the board, then white's advantages diminish. The advantage in development is less relevant with the queens off the board, and there not being a chance to really create good checkmating attacks against the black king. The queens coming off the board slows down the tempo of the game and will allow black time to get pieces into the game and off of their starting squares. So, in this position, of course, white doesn't want to play queen takes d5. So, you here naturally want to capture with the knight, but that is going to allow pawn to e6, and then after the knight moves, there's the queen trade. It turns out that Almasi goes for this idea, which is a really strong idea. He still has an advantage in that position, though he does miss a win. One thing I want to point out, though, is if white plays something really innocuous, like king to b1 in this position, that's when you get pawn to e6 right away. King b1, pawn to e6, and in this position, with the center closed and the tempo slowing down, black has reestablished some decent central presence with the pawn chain, and black has time to develop the pieces even as insufficiently active as they are right now, and black is actually doing okay. So we got to keep the tempo up. Knight takes d5. Now, pawn to e6, pushing the knight away. Well, in fact, the knight doesn't have to retreat. Almasi does retreat it, but the best move is a really brilliant move, queen to c4. Almasi found two brilliant moves in this game. One we've seen in pawn to c5, and one we'll see later. but he missed this third brilliant move. This move sacrifices the knight, and it's totally winning for white. The point is that after black captures the knight and is up a full rook, because black was already up in exchange, after rook takes d5, white's pieces are able to break through. But this is kind of risky. It's hard to go for this if you haven't calculated everything. And while computers calculate perfectly, and so they see that this is winning, for a human, there's a real chance that you miss something and black has a defense. In this position, though, after the queen moves, the rook comes up, the rook and queen are threatening f7. So queen e6. Then the queen can move over queen d4. What's impressive here is that down a rook, white can be very patient with the strong pieces that white has and the central control. A move here that black would likely play is bishop to h6, trying to trade some pieces and develop the knight. And the knight can come out to h6 and defend this pawn. White is also threatening bishop c4, so black can't just sit around. After bishop h6, though, bishop takes, knight takes, then white can play bishop c4. The queen can come out to g4 or to possibly other squares, and white is so patient. Pawn to f4. It turns out that there's no defense for black in this position. White has ideas like pawn to e6, threatening f7 and threatening this rook on h8, and black just doesn't have any good defense against this idea of e6, about the idea of taking on f7 in some cases if the knight moves, about queen d6 check. It's actually just a crushing advantage for white. But in the game, white does not sacrifice the knight and go for this very computery brilliant idea. Instead, Almasi plays knight c3, which would be a good move if queen c4 wasn't so brilliant and strong. After knight c3, we get queen takes d4, rook takes d4. Black has achieved a queen exchange at the cost of a pawn. So white now has a pawn for the exchange, still has great central control, and still has active pieces. In this position, the best for black was pawn to g5, right away, trying to get this bishop to move and surrender this pawn here on e5. After g5, bishop takes g5. You don't want to retreat because then black is starting to harass the bishop and getting real counterplay. Bishop takes g5, bishop takes e5, rook d7. Rooks on the 7th rank are famously very strong. Pawn to h6, bishop to d2, rook to b8, defending this pawn. Then white can play a move like f4, the bishop is pushed back, and b4. This line isn't exactly forced, but it's very representative. Essentially, white is going to have one pawn for the exchange. Black is still going to be struggling to develop the pieces, but what black has achieved is eliminating that very strong pawn on e5 that was restricting the bishop and restricting the knight. As a result, black has kind of the best position here that black has had in quite a while, and black should have tried to play in this way. Instead, black tries rook to c8, trying to go and attack this pawn on c5. But after rook c8, white simply plays rook d7. And there's actually no threat to capture on c5 because if you do capture, rook check, king here, and this is a pretty and instructive checkmate. So after rook d7, white is threatening to capture on b7 and has basically a tempo up on the line that black could have had. Now black plays g5, but the inclusion of rook to c8, rook to d7 benefits white. After g5 here, we get bishop takes g5. It was actually stronger just to pull back with bishop to e3, but we'll leave that for another day. And black plays pawn to a6. This is a mistake. Black should have captured on e5. And in this position, after rook takes b7, and then black can capture on c5 because the king is no longer getting checkmated, white can play bishop e3, and after the rook falls back, white is in position to also win this pawn, and white has very, very good winning chances, but there's still a game to play. Black has captured the pawn on e5, and so there's the ability for the black king to escape to safety and for these pieces to eventually develop. White's pieces are much more active. White is going to have two passed pawns over on that side of the board, but still, the game is not over. Instead, black tries pawn to a6. trying to push the bishop away, and then maybe go for the lines we just saw where there won't be a pawn hanging on a7. But it is white to move, and it's time again to pause your video and try to figure out what white should play. For the second time, Almasi smashes through with the c-pawn. Pawn to c6. Both of the brilliant moves he plays in this game are advances of the c-pawn. First to c5 and then to c6. In this case, Almasi is sacrificing the bishop on b5. So he is going to be down a full rook. Of course, you need to take this bishop on b5 because if you capture on c6, then you have bishop takes a6 and black's position is just crumbling here. White is absolutely dominating their ideas of first just securing the pawn up on f4, bringing the knight in at some point, going after the c-pawn. White is just totally dominating in this position. So Guseinov does capture the bishop. Now white plays pawn takes b7. This is a passed pawn, a pawn that has nothing in its path, no pawns in its path, preventing its promotion. The pawn is one square away from reaching the final rank and becoming a queen, and black's rook is dedicated to stopping it, becoming entirely passive in the process. After rook to b8, white simply plays the move pawn to f4. I love the patience here. White is down a rook, the queens are off the board, but let's just make sure we have that pawn on e5 nice and safe, and there is nothing that black can do against the idea of knight takes b5, and then boom, a4, a5, a6, a7. Black's pieces are totally passive, and it's all about the active white pieces and the passed pawns on the queen side. At this point, black is totally lost, although of course it takes good play to prove it, and Guseinov does still have a trick up his sleeve. So, after pawn to f4, we see bishop h6 trying to trade off the strong bishop. Of course, that is very sensible, the best try. Bishop takes h6, knight takes h6, knight takes b5, getting the b5 pawn, and more importantly than getting the b5 pawn, clearing the path for the a pawn to march up the board. Also, the knight is looking to go into d6, which could be massive. King over to e8, attacking the rook. The rook simply slides over and threatens rook to c8 check, making the promotion possible. So the king moves over to d8, pawn to a4. The a pawn gets rolling, knight to f5. And this is another good position to pause and ask yourself what you would play. Well, if you played pawn to a5, you've missed black's defense. Guseinov is a tricky player. Grandmasters never make it easy, even when they have lost positions. Here, black has the brilliant move knight to d4, and white still has quite a bit of work to do here. The point is that, yes, the knight is hanging, but it is pulling this knight on b5 away from the defense of the rook on c7. Now, white can play a sequence that is going to happen in the game, but black, in this position, after things come off, will have this f7 pawn, and that will provide good defensive chances. So, white doesn't rush. Instead, white says, hey, you can't actually do anything in this position. So after knight f5, I'm not going to push pawn to a5 and let you try this knight d4 trick. I'm just going to go take your pawn at f7. And then I can get ready to push the pawn on the next few moves. So in this position, black actually decides, you know what, you're right. There's no defense that I have. So black tries moving the king over to attack the rook. The rook goes back, and in this position, black attacks the rook again, but now without the pawn on f7, white says, you know what, now's the time to push pawn to a5. Black, again, has to try knight d4. There's nothing better. This is a good moment to pause and try to calculate your way to that final victory. Well, the conclusion is rook to c8 check. The point is that, yes, you're giving up your b7 pawn, but after you trade off the rooks, you can go win the knight, and you're up a ton of material. Rook takes c8, pawn takes c8, becoming a queen with check, and then in this position, black resigned because after king takes c8, knight takes d4, this is totally winning for white. It's important that there is no longer this pawn on f7. If black had that pawn, white with 3 pawns for the rook with the knight would have a material advantage, but it would be possible for black to try to defend. Without this f7 pawn, now this pawn is hanging, and white is in position to have both passed pawns on the queen side, connected passed pawns, and to create connected passed pawns on the king side. With so many pawns battling against the rook and the knight being a powerful force in the center of the board, there's really no hope for black, which is why Guseinov resigned in this position. So I hope that you've enjoyed the first video in this series. We've dug deep into the importance of controlling the center, given you some tips as to how to do that. Looked at a beautiful game with some incredible ideas from Almasi, first with a breakthrough out of the opening in the center, and then later with the passed pawns. All very, very instructive. We'll continue looking at the opening in the next game as we do a deeper dive into the problems of a lack of development like we saw in this game.